Bring it.
Bring it.
All right, where's my? There's turn heat on. Come on.
Okay.
Okay. Can you hear me? Can you hear me in the mic?
Turn it up a little maybe, back there.
Talking, talk, talk. Hello. Talk. Talk. Hello. Can you hear me?
Good for me.
Is that
I can hear
good?
you. I didn't know if you were
All right.
doing us. Okay.
Before we get started, I just want to make sure there's no questions or comments or anything from anybody. We're good? All right. So we're just going to jump right into it. There's a lot to go over. I know that we won't get through everything, but hopefully we'll get to the point where I want to get to. If there ever was enough evidence to compel someone into believing a certain faith, this would be it. The evidence that we will discuss have converted many skeptics, atheists, Muslims to Christianity. I could literally take up the entire class discussing previous skeptics who converted to Christianity because they looked into the evidence of the resurrection. Here are a few examples. Lee Strobel, up-and-coming investigative reporter for the Chicago Tribune, who set out to disprove the resurrection to save his wife from the religious cult that is Christianity. He became the writer for Case for Christ. J. Warner Wallace, world-renowned cold case detective, was nicknamed the Evidence Whisperer. Grievous an atheist until he looked into the evidence of the resurrection. He now recently wrote the author of Cold Case Christianity. Sir Lionel LeCoux, Guinness World Record holder for establishing 245 consecutive defenses in murder cases. So here's a guy that knows how to read evidence, understand the evidence. He was an atheist who was challenged to look into the evidence for the resurrection. He became a Christian. His quote, I say unequivocally that the evidence of the resurrection of Jesus Christ is so overwhelming that it compels acceptance by proof which leaves absolutely no room for doubt. Rabbi Pinchas Lapid, a Jewish theologian and Israeli historian, taught at the Hebrew University in Israel. He was an Israeli diplomat and was instrumental in gaining recognition for the young state of Israel. He looked into the evidence for the resurrection, and although he did not recognize the divinity of Jesus, he concluded that the God of Israel must have raised Jesus from the dead. So those are just a few examples, but like I said, there's so many.
What was the name of the second man? I'm sorry.
J. Warner Wallace.
Jay Warner?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Used to be a cold case detective for the New York Police Department. Now, before I get into it, I just want to explain the direction that we're going to go for the next few classes because I think it's important to understand. First, we're going to discuss the evidence for the resurrection of Jesus. Then we'll be answering the question, so what if Jesus did raise from the dead? Why is it a big deal that the one man throughout all history to be raised from the dead just so happens to be Jesus? What can we conclude about Jesus from the New Testament? And finally, we'll be answering the question, is the New Testament even reliable? And to answer that, we will look into the scholarly work of textual criticism of the New Testament. Let me just say for a moment to express the importance of the last one. My faith, my own faith, has never been shaken so hard than when in college and I had that I attended had us to look into the textual criticism of the New Testament. And that is because I was not prepared for this type of criticism. So if you are just watching this for the evidence of the resurrection, please continue throughout the completion of the entire lesson. It's important to not just hear one side and not hear the other side. If it wasn't for the fact of Easter was coming next weekend, I would probably teach this first by starting with the reliability of the New Testament and then working the exact opposite order. But once again, I can't express enough how important it is to have an understanding of all these different topics. Also, I want to say that after the study, you will have a reasonable understanding of the historical evidence. However, there is so much more out there to know. If you want to take an in-depth look into the resurrection, I would strongly recommend the works of both N.T. Wright and Gary Habermas.
How does Gary spell his last name?
It's up here on the slide.
Oh, sorry.
Okay. See some people still right. With all that being said, let us look at the deductive argument for the resurrection of Jesus. There are certain facts about Jesus that need an explanation. The best explanation of these facts is that God raised Jesus from the dead. If God raised Jesus from the dead, then God exists. Therefore, God exists. Now, this is a valid argument, but is it sound? If you are unfamiliar with deductive arguments, please watch our first meeting video for the class where I explain how deductive arguments work. Now, let's take a look at premise 1 and decide if it's more true than false. First of all, let's discuss why these are considered historical facts. Now, there are people called scholars. What is a scholar? A scholar is a specialist in a certain branch of knowledge. It is someone who studies a particular topic so much he has established himself as an expert on the topic. Scholars who study history are called historians, and we will be discussing the work of New Testament historians. Now, it is important to note that one is not required to be a Christian to be a New Testament historian. In fact, there are several New Testament historians that are skeptical towards the Christian faith. To be a historian, one is required to look at the presented data with a certain level of criticism. Now, I will probably be using the terms historians and scholars interchangeably. Don't get confused, it means the same thing. The facts that we will be discussing are facts that are either the majority of historians agree with or practically all historians agree with. And I will be discussing which one is which, but I want to make sure that you understand that none of these facts are facts that only Christians believe. These are facts that are established by the majority of New Testament historians, whether Christians or not. Fact number 1. Okay, hold on. This isn't fact number 1. The Jewish man named Jesus that is discussed in the Bible actually existed. Now, no reputable New Testament historian denies this fact. Let's go back in case people want to write that down.
Are you going to post?
Yeah.
Are these written form that you can post?
Yeah,
on?
this will all be, I'll be distributing my notes and distributing the PowerPoint and all that stuff.
Oh, okay.
All right. No reputable New Testament historian denies this fact. However, for whatever reason, there are those that do deny this fact. A recent study by Barna Research concluded that 40% of England denies that Jesus ever existed. Okay? Now, all I'm going to do here is just quote Bart Ehrman. For those who don't know who Bart Ehrman is, he is the most prominent New Testament scholar who is also a skeptic of Christianity. I believe he has challenged Christianity far more than any other of those in the new atheist movement. I will talk more about him when I discuss the reliability of the New Testament. But for this quote, keep in mind that Bart Ehrman is not a Christian. Bart Ehrman was involved in the Q&A for a book that he wrote. A man told Bart that he did not believe that there is any evidence that Jesus even existed. Bart Ehrman responded, well, this is a long quote. Don't try to write this down. Well, I do. That's why I wrote the book. I have a whole book on it. There is a lot of evidence. There is so much evidence. I know that in the crowds you run around with, it is commonly thought that Jesus did not exist. Let me tell you, once you get out of your conclave, there is nobody. I mean, this is not even an issue for scholars of antiquity. It is not an issue for scholars of antiquity. There is no scholar at any college or university in the Western world who teaches classics, ancient history, New Testament, early Christianity, or any related field who doubts that Jesus existed. Now, that is not evidence. Just because everybody thinks so doesn't make it evidence. But if you want to know about the theory of evolution versus the theory of creationism, and every scholar at every reputable institution in the world believes in evolution, it may not be evidence, but if you got a different opinion, you better got a pretty good piece of evidence yourself. The reason for thinking that Jesus existed is because he is abundantly attested in early sources. That is why. And I give the details in my book. Early and independent sources indicate that certainly Jesus existed. One author that we know about knew Jesus' brother and knew Jesus' closest disciple, Peter. He is an eyewitness to both Jesus' closest disciple and his brother. So, I'm sorry. I respect your disbelief, but if you want to go where the evidence goes, I think that atheists have done themselves a disservice by jumping on the bandwagon of mythicism, because frankly, it makes you look foolish to the outside world. If that's what you're going to believe, you just look foolish. Now, I want to
don't bother with that premise.
Yeah, I want to reiterate that Bart Ehrman is not a Christian at all. He is extremely skeptical towards Christianity, but he is a New Testament historian, and this is his conclusion. All right. 2. Jesus had a number of disciples who were Jews that believed Jesus was the Jewish Messiah and grew the early Christian church through evangelism. All right? Once again, no one really denies this. This is just historical fact. All right. Number 3, Jesus was a criminal under Roman authorities and died by Roman crucifixion. Now, no reputable New Testament historian denies this fact. However, the entire Muslim religion denies this fact. So it's an issue. Yeah. Go back one. Okay. Now, because, like basically a third of the world has to deny this fact because of their religion, we'll discuss it. But once again, no reputable New Testament historian denies this fact because the evidence for it is just so great. All right, but because there's so much evidence, it makes it a big problem for Muslims. One objection to this fact is that Jesus did not die by crucifixion, because maybe he was on the brink of death, but he did not actually die. All right, this objection goes against everything that we know historically and medically. Roman soldiers were expert killers. They knew through experience the signs of death. They would face death if they managed not to kill somebody charged with a death sentence. So they were highly influenced to do their job. There is only one example in antiquity where it is mentioned that a man survived crucifixion. And it's mentioned by Josephus. And when I was sent by Titus Caesar with the Cyrilians and 1,000 horsemen to a certain village called Thecoa, in order to know whether it was a place fit for a camp, as I came back, I saw many captives crucified, and remembered 3 of them as my former acquaintance. I was very sorry at this in my mind, and went with tears in my eyes to Titus, and told him of them. So he immediately commanded them to be taken down, and to have the greatest care taken of them, in order to their recovery. Yet 2 of them died under the physician's hands, while the 3rd recovered. Okay? This is the only time where this is mentioned where somebody survived Roman crucifixion. But in this example, these men were taken down by Roman authority. They were told to take them down, and they were immediately given the best Roman medical care available. And even then, only 1 of the 3 survived. At no point were the Romans trying to save Jesus' life. Their intention was to kill him. And there is no example of the Romans ever not succeeding in killing someone they intended to kill. Now consider when the scriptures say that when his side was pierced, blood and water came out. I don't know if you all got... I'm going to read this. All right, I'm going to quote from John 19:33-34. But when they came to Jesus and found that he was already dead, they did not break his legs. Instead, one of the soldiers pierced Jesus' side with a spear, bringing a sudden flow of blood and water. All right. This fact further indicates that the gospel writer was actually just giving the details of the events, as he would not have known the medical implications of what he wrote. We now know through modern medicine why this occurred. Jesus was going through what is called hypovolemic shock, meaning he lost so much blood he was going into shock. A sustained heartbeat caused by hypovolemic shock causes fluid to gather in the sac around the heart and the lungs. The gathering of fluid in the membrane around the heart is called the pericardial effusion. And I think there's a picture of that. Okay. And around the lungs, it is called the pleural effusion. This is why blood and water came out whenever Jesus' side was pierced. Now, there's no way that John could have known that this is why this occurred, or why this occurred. He was just writing what happened. But let's just say that we ignore all the historical and medicinal facts about the crucifixion and say Jesus survived somehow. Would this have inspired the disciples of Jesus? No. Instead of praising God, they would have been seeking medical care for Jesus. This would not have inspired the Christian church to start. This would not have been seen as a miracle for them to radically change. So it just makes no sense that this is an explanation of Jesus not dying by crucifixion. So Muslims usually now instead infer that Allah intervened supernaturally and tricked everyone into believing that Jesus died and rose from the dead. That Allah fooled everybody into believing this. Thus, Allah deceived everyone and was the reason for the start of Christianity. That's their explanation. I'm not making this up, but I'm not here to talk about Islam or to refute Islam, but the overwhelming facts of Jesus' death by crucifixion is a major problem to anyone to deny it. All right. Number 4. Jesus' body was buried in a tomb by Joseph of Arimathea in Jerusalem. Everybody got it? All right. Anything that has to deal with the tomb of Jesus is going to be the most contested fact among New Testament historians that we'll talk about today. But most historians, the majority, it's been estimated about 75%, believe that Jesus was buried in a tomb in Jerusalem. But not all of them. This is the most contested one we'll talk about. Mainly because they state that the only time the empty tomb is discussed is in the Gospels. And so it's to reiterate Jesus is rising from the dead. Maybe it didn't actually happen. But these are the most skeptical towards Christianity. That goes towards this direction. Also, there was no real evidence to show that anyone died by crucifixion and was put into a mass. There was no real evidence to show that anyone that died by crucifixion was not put into a mass grave. That's usually what happened. You died on the cross, and they just threw you into a hole with everybody else. They all went into the same one. That is until 1968, when archaeologists discovered a tomb in Jerusalem which contained a heel bone with a nail through it. And this man, Yohanan, the son of Hagakol, I don't know. I can't pronounce that. But he died by crucifixion and was not put into a mass grave. He was put into a tomb. He was put into a Jewish tomb. So this proved that this did happen. This was not, something that never happened. We have proof that this was an actual thing. You take this plus what's written in Josephus's in his Wars of the Jews. He quotes, Nay, they proceeded to that degree of impiety as to cast away their dead bodies without burial. Although the Jews used to take so much care of the burial of men, they took down those that were condemned and crucified and buried them before going down of the sun. So Josephus tells us that the Jews pleaded with the Romans to have them buried into a tomb and not be put into a mass grave.
So was Josephus considered a Christian or just a historian?
A story. Josephus was not. Josephus's work is not considered a Christian source. Now you take all this plus how scriptures indicated that Joseph of Arimathea of the Jewish Sanhedrin took responsibility for the burial. Now Joseph is described as a rich man, a member of the Jewish Sanhedrin. The Sanhedrin was a sort of Jewish high court made up of 70 of the leading men of Judaism, which presided in Jerusalem. There was an understandable hostility in the early church towards Jewish Sanhedrists. In Christian eyes, they had engineered a judicial murder of Jesus. The sermons in Acts, for example, go so far as to say that the Jewish leaders crucified Jesus. Now, given his status as a Sanhedrist, all of whom, which the Gospel of Mark reports, voted to condemn Jesus, Joseph is the last person one would expect to care properly for Jesus. Thus, according to the late New Testament scholar Raymond Brown, now, all the Gospels know, some say this, and others say this, and others say that. Some, not every story's in every Gospel, but none of the Gospels leave out the empty tomb. Also, consider 1 Corinthians chapter 15, 3, verse 5. The majority of scholars believe this to be an early creed which dates as early as 5 years after Jesus' death. It's known as probably the earliest of all writings that we have in the New Testament. Now there is a clear comparison of the 4-line formula mentioned in this creed with Acts and with the Gospels. Now I was going to write it on the board, but I don't have enough room. So I'll go through this. In 1 Corinthians 15, 3 through 5, it says, Christ died. And then in Acts chapter 13, 28 through 31, though they could charge him with nothing deserving death, yet they asked Pilate to have him killed. And in Mark chapter 15, 37 through 16, verse 7, they say, and Jesus uttered a loud cry and breathed his last. Okay? So back to he, meaning Joseph, bought a linen shroud, taking him down, wrapped him in the linen shroud, and laid him in a tomb. In Corinthians, it says he was raised. In Acts, it says, but God raised him from the dead. And in Mark, it says he was risen. He's not here, out in Galilee, Jerusalem, who are now his witnesses to the people. And in Mark, he says, but go tell his disciples and Peter that he is going through before you to Galilee. There you will see him. So you can see that it all lines up. Okay? It basically is talking about the same thing. We also know that Christians from the start proclaiming in Jesus' physical resurrection. If the Romans or Jewish leaders wanted to put an end to Christianity, all they needed to do was to produce a dead body. However, what does the Scriptures tell us? Matthew 28, verse 11 through 15. While the women were on their way, some of the guards went into the city and reported to the chief priest everything that had happened. When the chief priests had met with the elders and devised a plan, they gave the soldiers a large sum of money, telling them, "You are to say, his disciples came during the night and stole him away while we were asleep. If this report gets to the governor, we will satisfy him and keep you out of trouble." So the soldiers took the money and did as they were instructed, and this story has been widely circulated among the Jews to this very day. Again, why would they make this up? They even state that this is the story that circulates among the Jewish people to this very day, meaning during the time the gospel was circulating. Why would the gospel writer write this if it wasn't true? Somebody could read it and say, no, that's not what's going on. So it just doesn't make any sense. There's a reason why the majority of historians believe that Jesus was buried in a tomb. Now, another reason why we believe that Jesus was buried in a tomb is for the next fact. Let's go to fact number 5. Oh, we missed all this. Okay. Some of Jesus' women disciples said that they discovered his tomb empty, and B, they saw the resurrected Jesus. Is 5 not in there? Okay. I must have messed something up. Okay. Some of Jesus' women disciples said that they A, discovered his tomb empty, and B, they saw the resurrected Jesus. Did we all get that? Now, because this has to do with the tomb, this fact is contested, but once again, the majority of New Testament scholars believe in this fact. Why? Embarrassing testimony. An indicator that an event or saying is authentic occurs when the source would not be expected to create the story because it embarrasses his cause and weakened its position in arguments with its opponents. That's by Gary Habermas and Michael Lacuna. They're both New Testament scholars. Now, why would it be embarrassing to testify that it was women who discovered the empty tomb and saw the resurrected Jesus? Now, in order to grasp this point, we need to understand 2 things. First, women were not regarded as credible witnesses. The attitude toward the testimony of women is evident in Josephus' description and of the rules supposedly left by Moses for admissible testimony. Quote, "Let not the testimony of women be admitted on account of the levity and boldness of their sex. Now, no such regulation is to be found in the first 5 books of the Bible, but it is rather a reflection of the patriarchal society of first century Judaism. Second, women occupied a low rung on the Jewish social ladder. Compared to men, women were second-class citizens. Consider these rabbinical texts. Sota 19. Sooner let the words of the law be burnt than delivered to women. I can't pronounce this word. Well, happy is he whose children are male, but unhappy is he whose children are female. The next quote, this is a daily prayer of every Jewish man, including the benediction. Blessed are you, Lord our God, ruler of the universe, who has not created me a woman. That should be on the next slide. It's not? Okay.
Thank goodness.
Now,
Thank goodness they're already dead.
now, given their low social status and inability to serve as legal witnesses, it's quite amazing that it is women who are the discoverers of and the principal witnesses to the empty tomb. If the intention of the early Christian church leaders were to make up information to start a widespread religion, they would not have said that while the male disciples were hiding in fear, the women went to the tomb. They would not have stated that it was women who first discovered the empty tomb, and it was women who first witnessed the resurrected Jesus. It would have sounded much nicer if it was Peter, James, and John who discovered the empty tomb and were the first witnesses of the resurrected Jesus. So there's no reason why they would make this up. Zero. It doesn't make sense. You can try to come up with a reason, but I've yet to hear one that makes any sense to me.
So in other words, if you're trying to make something up, you're going to be sure that absolutely
Yeah.
everything you say is believable.
Yeah. If you were to say that, how do you know Jesus raised from the dead? Well, the women saw it. That really wouldn't fly in first century. It would have been much better story as, we men went to the empty tomb and Jesus was there, standing there, and congratulated us on our faith and bravery. But that's not what was written down. So it's just the Bible is full of embarrassing testimony, which indicates that they were just writing what happened. They weren't making it up. All right. Number 6. I hope number 6 is on there. All right. Jesus' male disciples believed Jesus was raised from the dead and believed that Jesus was the Jewish Messiah, the Son of God. And they were willing to suffer and or die for this belief. All right. This fact is not really contested among scholars. There are few skeptics, but the vast majority accept this as a fact. We know James, the brother of John, and James, the brother of Jesus, both died for their beliefs. We know how James, the brother of Jesus, died, not from the Bible or a Christian source, but from a non-Christian historical source. We also believe that James, the brother of Jesus, did not believe that Jesus was the Messiah until after he believed he witnessed the resurrected Jesus. Now, one may object by saying that there are plenty of people willing to die for their beliefs. I mean, look at suicide bombings for Islam. All right? Now, we must understand there is a difference between those examples and the situation that the disciples were in. The disciples were in the position of actually knowing whether the event occurred or not. While people today are willing to die for the testimony and beliefs they heard from other people, the disciples were first-hand eyewitnesses to the event. And people who know for a fact that something is false are not willing to be tortured and killed for it. So we know that they were convinced that it was true, and we know that they were in the position to know if it was true or false. All right, fact number 7. There was a Pharisee named Saul who persecuted Christians, claimed he saw the resurrected Jesus, converted to Christianity, proclaimed the gospel to convert others to Christianity, helped establish the early Christian church. He suffered persecution for his beliefs and most likely died because of it. While you're writing this down, I'll just say once again, this fact is mostly uncontested. The vast majority of New Testament scholars believe this to be a fact.
The movie Paul is really, really good.
There's a lot of movies coming out that I want to see.
And you said that the thing about Paul is largely undisputed by most scholars.
Correct. By the vast majority. Like 90-some%. Like the vast majority. Only the most skeptical of scholars would dispute this. Now these are established historical facts concerning Jesus' resurrection. Some of them are contested among New Testament scholars, but the majority of them are not really contested at all. The only one that is really contested is concerning the tomb of Jesus. And as I have said, the majority of historians believe that Jesus was buried in a tomb, and the tomb was discovered empty. And there are very good reasons for us to believe this. They're not just believing it because of their Christian faith or something like that. There's good evidence to show that that actually occurred. So, how does one explain these facts? There are a few possibilities given by New Testament scholars, but what is the best explanation? To decide how we will infer to the best explanation, we will use C. Behan McCulloch's 7 criteria for the testing of a historical hypothesis. This includes that 1, the hypothesis must imply further statements describing present observable data. 2, the hypothesis must have greater explanatory scope than rival hypotheses. 3, the hypothesis must have greater explanatory power than rival hypotheses. 4, the hypothesis must be more plausible than rival hypotheses. 5, the hypothesis must be less ad hoc than rival hypotheses. 6, the hypothesis must be disconfirmed by fewer accepted beliefs than rival hypotheses. And 7, the hypothesis must so exceed its rivals in fulfilling conditions 2 through 6 that there is little chance of a rival hypothesis exceeding it in meeting these conditions. Now, looking at the criteria, we may notice an issue that will arise. How can the resurrection of Jesus be considered the most plausible? I mean, if Jesus was raised from the dead, then we got a miracle on our hands. But isn't the very definition of a miracle the least likely event? Surely, it can never be considered the more plausible event. Or can it? And we'll pick up with miracles with our next meeting. But just with this information alone, I think you can, if you have had any discussion, you found it. I think if you've had any discussion with anybody and come up with rival reasons of why, that these historical facts, once again, these are facts that we know happen, and these facts deserve an explanation for all of them. There is no good explanation to cover all these facts besides what the Bible says happened, actually happened. All right, and that's where we'll close. Does anybody have any questions?
I was able to do a shorthand on this 7. So I got 4, 5, and 6. You see what 1, 2, and 3 are?
Yeah. Can you go to 1, 2, and 3?
And so basically what they're saying on this is that if you can't find enough of an imbalance, you have to accept the balance. Or
It's
there's
saying,
not enough evidence to dispute
Yeah.
it, therefore this holds more weight.
right, it's basically, if you're going to come up with a natural explanation or come up with another hypothesis than what the Bible actually says, then it has to explain all these facts. For example, we'll get into it, but like just one example, some may believe that they hallucinated the appearances of Jesus. That they think that it was just a hallucination or vision or something like that. Now, medically, we know that people do have hallucinations for dead loved ones or something like that. But we'll discuss why this doesn't make any sense for this case. For example, we know mass hallucinations do not occur. Hundreds of people do not have the same hallucination. And it also doesn't explain the empty tomb.
So you say that 90, made a statement of 90 plus believe a certain thing, okay? And there's these few that may prove this. So we're talking about facts.
Yeah. As much as you can say, we're not talking about like a scientific fact or a mathematical fact. We're talking about historical facts, and that they're different.
They're disputable.
Well, as much as you can dispute that George Washington was the first president of the United States. Like all our previous American history as a big conspiracy, and we're all led to believe something else, something like that. So we're talking about with anything in history, we gain facts through eyewitness testimony, stuff written in journals, all this sort of stuff, and you collect that together to make a conclusion, and that's how you put together a historical fact.
So basically, historical issues are harder to prove, but also harder to disprove. And if the proofs like this keep coming, they're going to have a much harder time disproving.
Exactly. Like we will not take just one of these facts by itself. You have to have an explanation for all of them. And because of that, that's why so many people that were skeptics, that were atheists, that looked into the historical facts and the evidence for Jesus' resurrection, came to the conclusion that indeed Jesus did raise from the dead. Regardless of how, obviously people don't raise from the dead. We know that to be true. But in this case, the evidence leads us into believing that Jesus did raise from the dead. Now, you can come to the conclusion of the rabbi into not believing his divinity, but based upon this evidence alone, it's hard to deny it. Now, after this, we'll go into why it's a big deal for the one man in all of history to be raised from the dead was Jesus. Why is that a big deal? What did Jesus say about himself? What can we establish that Jesus said of himself? What did he think of himself? And we'll discuss that after we get through this. But we'll discuss why it's such a big deal that Jesus rose from the dead.
When you're talking about proving historical issues, there was a man probably about 15, 20 years ago in Germany who was trying to teach schools that the Holocaust didn't happen.
Mm-hmm.
Which was unwise on his part because so many people lived through it that they're still alive then. If he was going to do that, he should have waited 100 years.
Yeah. Like, well, we'll get into, I think my wife's leaving.
Question came through on the live feed. What about Lazarus?
What about Lazarus? What historical evidence that we have that?
You mentioned that Jesus was the only one to come back from the dead. What about Lazarus?
Well, we don't. Most evidence that we have that Lazarus rose from the dead is based upon New Testament evidence. We don't have non-Christian sources stating Lazarus rose from the dead. So it is multiply attested. We don't even have non-Christian sources stating that Lazarus ever existed. So what I'm talking about is in the antiquity, in history, Jesus' existence was multiply attested, and these facts are multiply attested. And these facts lead you to the conclusion that he was raised from the dead. Now, I'll go into why we can believe that the New Testament to be accurate or reliable. I think accurate's the wrong word. Reliable. So we'll get into that. But I hope that answers your question.
So you
Okay. Anything else?
And that probably would go apply more to the next one, but when I was, when you think about the Bible, first, the Old Testament's basically written in Hebrew, New Testament's written in Greek.
Yeah.
Well, I studied both of those at Moody Bibles. And what I learned about the Hebrew language is that it's a very emotional language.
Mhm.
But there were tons and tons of witnesses. It was a longer span of time, tons and tons of witnesses. It was all written and rewritten and checked for errors. The New Testament was written in Greek, which is extremely factual, and they can have a bunch of different words to express the word love for different kinds of love.
Yeah.
So I think God chose that language in particular because it's so scientifically accurate, and in everything that's said, it's not this is a reasonable explanation of that. It's like that is the word that was used, period, and
Yeah. We know that Hebrew scholars, or Hebrew scribes that copied the Old Testament were very good at what they did, extremely good. We know this from like the Dead Sea Scrolls. Whenever when they discovered Isaiah, how that book that was like hundreds of years before Jesus ever lived to now, it's basically the same book. So they were very good at what they did. Now the New Testament's different. It's a different story. The scribes for the New Testament were not as good as being as exact when they were copying. However, we can conclude that well, I'll just before I leave you on this, I don't want to really get into it, but like we can some scholars say that we are 97%. We can be sure about 97% of the New Testament what was originally written. The 3% that we're unsure of has no effect on our faith at all.
I'll buy that.
Okay. Anything else?
This is great, thank you. And you're gonna send us some of
Yeah,
this?
I'll send everything out like I usually do.
Thank you.
Good job.
Yeah,
That's great, thank you.
All right.
really fast.
I gotta go home and go to bed because I work during the daytime
Oh my gosh.
Oh, golly.
now. I gotta get up at 4 in the morning.
Oh my God.
PowerPoint, by the way. This is very legible.
Okay, good. That's what I was saying before.
Size of